Anybody thinking about it for even a few seconds realizes that if there's a taxable event every time I transfer it to you, it can't be a currency. 7.8 billion people are using money that's toxic, and the nature of money has been bifurcated, and now the medium of exchange portion of money is sitting in fiat currencies, and the store of value element of money is now migrating into crypto assets. Bitcoin's mission is to be a crypto asset network. The idea is not to move money fast and privately. The idea of Bitcoin is to store $1 billion for 100 years securely.
Need motivation?
Watch the top 10 with Believe Nation.
Top 10, I got a top 10. Got my motivation high for my top 10. Gotta learn from the wise women and men. All my life, like 9 and 9. For my top 10, top 10, 9 and 9. This one's for my top 10.
Hey, it's Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more, and you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Michael Saylor, and my take on his top 10 rules for success. Enjoy. Okay, let's kick it off with rule number 1. View Bitcoin as an asset.
Most sophisticated people that have studied it realize they're crypto assets. Bitcoin is a crypto asset. It's not a cryptocurrency. It's a tragic misnomer. And because people call it a cryptocurrency, then it lends itself to a shallow criticism that it's not good as a currency because the central banks will ban it, and because the tax treatment is poor, and because the transaction rate is low. But again, those are all red herrings. It's not a currency, nor does it need to be a currency, right? Anybody thinking about it for even a few seconds realizes that if there's a taxable event every time I transfer it to you, it can't be a currency. So right. No, it's not a currency. It's an asset. And if you think of it as an asset, it's very helpful, because then you realize it's not competing with the dollar and the euro. It's competing with gold and silver. It's competing with bearer instruments, and to a certain degree, it's competing with bonds as a store of value, and it's competing with ETFs like the S&P 500 index as a store of value. And once you understand it that way, then you're not so afraid anymore, because you understand the regulatory framework that comes to Bitcoin is the same regulatory framework that comes to gold, silver, and S&P 500 indexes. It's just know your customer, anti-money laundering regulations. And if you're afraid to buy Bitcoin because you're afraid of regulation, you shouldn't be, because if it is regulated pari passu or at parity with these other assets, it will create an avalanche of institutional money flow into the asset class, because it'll simply normalize the treatment in the Western world. The IRS in 2014 deemed it to be property.
Right.
And as property, it means that when you transfer it, you owe a capital gains tax. So there is like zero chance the IRS is going to reverse that. It is property. It's not a currency.
Rule number 2, start small.
I started a company when I was 24, and we didn't have a lot of resources. I guess I took out like a $5,000 furniture loan. And then I implored my first employer, DuPont, to give me a $250,000 contract. And then I asked for like $100,000 in cash up front. And my negotiating technique was, they said, we don't normally do it. And I said, well, I don't have any money, and so I can't build the software you want unless you give me the money up front. And that negotiating strategy only works once in your life, but for me it worked. And so they wanted what I had to offer, and so they gave me the money. So we started with not that much capital. And when you don't have that much capital, you can't do anything. So we were building computer simulations based upon an existing piece of software that I had. And it was limited, but we did what we could, and we grew the company to like $750,000 a year, and then we grew it to $950,000 the next year. And we saw an opportunity to plug into a graphical interface. And the idea was give computer simulations to executives to predict the future. And the problem was it was kind of Delphic. They couldn't figure out what the assumptions were. So we thought, well, maybe we could actually create a piece of software that lets them plug in the assumptions. And of course, we couldn't afford to write it in C++, so we didn't even have the programming skills to build the software. It was like 1991 or so. So we found a product called Wings, which was like an Excel spreadsheet, but it had its own scripting language and graphical interface. It was one of the first graphical interface development tools. And we took that product and we plugged it into our simulation engine. And you know, that friend I told you about, friend/competitor, was a former professor from MIT. And so he had the PhD and he had all the knowledge, and I was just the kid, you know, trying to grow a company. So in his wisdom, what he said was, you know, like everybody knows that you got to use Excel if you use a spreadsheet. You can't use Wings. Excel is the winner. And my response was, yeah, it might be the market share leader, but it doesn't have the functionality. The technology just doesn't work for me. So I can either use Excel and fail, like take the safe choice and fail, or I can try something new and succeed. And he goes, well, you know, long term, that's not going to work. I said, well, you know, we all know that eventually Excel will crush them. Like all my business school case studies say that. So I said, yeah, but short term, we're going to fail. So we got to do something. So we built the product with Wings, and it was a screaming success, and the company doubled, and we became a $2 million company, and we became a $4 million company, and then we became an $8 million company, and then a $16 million company. And right around the time we were a $16 million company, he was still a $1 million consultancy because he hadn't taken the risk. And he was not at risk. He had no existential threats. Whereas we had a $16 million company with threats, which was Excel was going to squeeze Wings out of the business. And so the answer was we rebuilt our product on a Microsoft base. So we started using Visual Basic and Microsoft technology. And at that point, when we were 16 times bigger than that consultancy, he said, you know, every good software engineering company that I know uses C++. They don't use Visual Basic, you know, and so you're not going to get taken seriously. And I said, well, you know, I have people that can figure out how to do it in Visual Basic, and they can't figure out how to do it in C++. So we did it the other way, and then we doubled to 32 million, and we doubled to 64 million. And he stayed 1 million. And at 64 million, we had this existential risk, which is we needed to code part of our software in C++. But we, of course, were 64 times bigger than we had been, and we were 4x bigger than we were when we started. So we hired a lot of people, and we started coding it in C++. And he still had a secure consulting company that was $1 million with no risk.
Rule number 3, adopt the Bitcoin standard.
You've been advocating for the so-called Bitcoin standard. What do you mean by that?
I think that there's $500 trillion of monetary assets in the world, split between currencies, bonds, real estate, instruments, equities, precious metals that are being held as money, etc. Most of those are fiat derivatives, and so they derive their value in part or in whole from the expectation of future fiat cash flows. And I think right now in the world, you have a set of strong currencies losing 1% or more of their value a month. That'd be the US dollar and the euro, and everything pegged to the dollar and the euro. And I think you've got a set of weaker currencies losing 2% of their value a month. And then you've got a set of currencies that are collapsing. They're losing 3 to 4% of their value a month. All of the companies and the bonds and the commercial real estate in those economies are, of course, losing their monetary value because the currency that they're valued based upon is weakening. So the Bitcoin standard is all about converting your long-term treasury assets, that is your savings account, from a fiat derivative asset to a non-fiat derivative, a non-sovereign store of value that doesn't derive its value from cash flows in the future. And, you know, the 19th century solution was the gold standard, and the 21st century solution is the Bitcoin standard. And so that's what I mean when I say adopt the Bitcoin standard.
Rule number 4, take risks.
We adopted, the internet, and we started building our software to run on HTML. And people said, well, no big company uses HTML. It's a risky thing, and it might not be secure, or it doesn't do that. And we thought, we can't give the software to 20,000 people unless we try this. And so maybe we'll try to figure out the problem. So the result was, initially we built it and not that many people used it. And then we built it and people used more of it. And then we built the third version and everybody used it. And then the people that hadn't built the internet version got squeezed out of business. And then it went on. But at this point, right, the company is like 200 times bigger than the $1 million consultancy, which is still not at risk. But it's the difference between being a technology company and being a services company. Services companies don't take risks, and they don't pursue architectures. Technology companies need to take risk, and of course, eventually the mobile wave hit, and we rebuilt our software to run on iOS. And then people said, "Well, you're crazy. Android's the winner." So we built our software to run on Android. And eventually we had software running on PC operating systems, web operating systems, Android and iOS operating systems. And then, of course, eventually the web browsers changed to Chrome, and in plugins, we built something that supported plugins. And if you sign up for technology, I think you got to have this model in your head that you're a snake that's shedding its skin every 3-4 years. Or, a really good model in nature for growth under pressure is a chambered nautilus. And a chambered nautilus is this creature that grows under deep sea pressure, and it builds a shell. And of course, the shape of the chambered nautilus is this spiral, because the creature is rebuilding the next shell to be twice as big as the last shell, and turning in on itself, and is using its previous work as the structure to support the next piece of work. And so if you look at the design of a chambered nautilus, what you see is nature's solution for growth under pressure. And I think that's how technology companies work. You're just always growing. You can't abandon what you've done, but neither can you not move forward and not take risk and not branch off in a new area. So there's this very interesting dynamic dance between respect for the past and integrity and architecture versus the opportunity and the challenge of the future. And you're living in that zone in the middle.
Also, if you want to have more self-confidence and self-belief, I've designed a special free training to help you do it. The science says it can take up to 254 days of consecutive action to build a new habit. And I want that for you. I want you to build the habit of self-belief. So what I'm going to do is email you every day for 254 days a link to an unlisted video that will shift your belief forward. To get on it for free, the link to join is in the description below.
People always kind of dump on, fast food industry. If I had to do it again, I'd go work for McDonald's.
Oh no, you're okay. You should feel good about yourself. Like, you're fine the way you are. It's like you think, well, that's a calming message for people. It's like, no, it's not.
One of the real reasons we don't do the things that frighten us is because we are afraid of being judged.
Rule number 5, use statistics.
Statistics is probably one of the most valuable of the mathematical disciplines. I don't have occasion to exercise calculus of variations that often. So certain forms of math get programmed, and we have computers do it for us. But other sorts of math, you have to rely upon every day, every hour of the day in your head. And probably the most common thing is just practical application of statistics, stochastic outcomes, what's likely to happen, and using statistics to decide what metrics to focus upon. Because I feel like, for example, in the world, if I give you 100,000 assets and I keep track of the volatility and the return of the asset every minute of the day, every hour, every day, every week, or every month, I generate a huge amount of information, all of which is irrelevant. And only a practical appreciation of statistics will remind you that 99.99% of all the information in front of you is irrelevant. And so I probably would have spent more time on statistics. I wouldn't stress out so much about being able to, solve the orbital mechanic exercise, for a satellite, because that stuff gets programmed.
Rule number 6, don't pay using Bitcoin.
It's not very wise to transfer Bitcoin to pay for anything. I mean, if you were to say to me, I can pay you in Bitcoin, it doesn't make a lot of sense because the transactions are slow. But if I had highly appreciated Bitcoin, I would be accelerating a shorter or long-term capital gains bill in order to pay you. And so the only way that I would pay you in Bitcoin would be I would take $100, I would buy Bitcoin, and then 1 minute later, I would transfer the Bitcoin to you so that the basis in the Bitcoin is equal at the time I acquired it and the time that I transferred it. So I think that this is a vestige from the first decade when there were a lot of retail users of Bitcoin and before they understood the law. But the law has been very clear in the U.S. since 2014. And any institution, right, any high net worth individual, any corporation, any institutional investor understands that you acquire this stuff, you're going to hold it. Now, I'll make one more point. It's doesn't make any sense to pay for anything in Bitcoin for two reasons. The first reason is because it's a taxable event. Mm-hmm. And you're a fool to accelerate taxes on your own person by a decade. The second reason it doesn't make sense is because it's a long duration asset that's deflationary, which means it's likely to go up in value. It's been going up 150 to 200% a year every year for a decade. So why would you pay $1 million in Bitcoin to buy something which is going to depreciate in value when the $1 million in Bitcoin may very well double 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more times, right? So it's a long-term investment asset.
Rule number 7, understand crypto assets.
If you want to really be involved in the world of finance, the number one thing to do is figure out Bitcoin and understand the basis of crypto asset network because 7.8 billion people are using money that's toxic, and the nature of money has been bifurcated, and now the medium of exchange portion of money is sitting in fiat currencies. And the store of value element of money is now migrating into crypto assets and into Bitcoin in specific. So everything you'd study in finance is going to be rendered largely irrelevant in the next 10 years unless you really grasp the underlying theory of money. I think that the best way to learn that is probably not in school at all. The truth is you probably should go on YouTube. And you should, if you go to hope.com or the like, you'll find an entire set of videos on this. You can learn anything in YouTube. A lot of university courses are 10, 20, 30, 40 years behind the times, and there's a lot of inertia in them. But if I told you that somebody invented something 10 years ago that obsolesced 50 to 90% of the finance industry in the last decade, you would say, what is that thing? Well, that thing is Bitcoin. And so I wouldn't stress that much about being in a top 10 school or not being in an Ivy League school. I think that today you can get cutting edge insight just going on the internet. And once you figure out what you want to learn, you can teach yourself. In fact, you can teach yourself. You can bend time and space. I can go anywhere on Earth, anytime on Earth, pull up a streaming video and watch it at 2x or 150x, skip through it. And so I almost look back on my college education and I think sitting in a classroom, listening to things at the time scale of 1 minute equals 1 minute, and going through a semester at the same rate as everybody else, subject to the syllabus of a single professor, is a very crippling way to learn and for the mind to develop. So in a way, we have opportunities that are better now.
Rule number 8, think from first principles.
I think probably the most valuable thing that I learned from MIT was to think from first principles and to be intellectually fearless. MIT is just is an entire university full of very bright people, but intellectually fearless people. My freshman classmates, one of them started a computer company, and launched a Pac-Man competitor and got a cease and desist letter from Commodore Computing, the game company. Another one designed hardware that went on the space shuttle. Another one used to rip down and fix his own cars for fun on the weekends, and they were just capable people that weren't afraid to do something.
And what does that mean to be intellectually fearless? Like, you're not afraid of looking stupid? You're not afraid of breaking something? What is that?
In my first material science class, the professor comes out, and we're literally all freshmen. It's the first hour of our time in the class, and maybe it's like a freshman year class, like freshman year, first semester. So it's early. So the professor walks out in the first lecture and he holds up a tile and he says, I'm a consultant to NASA and this tile burned off the space shuttle on re-entry last week. So they have a problem. They don't know why. They flew me down to talk about it. So they gave me the tile. We had a deep discussion. They're still not sure. He says, so here's the tile. What do you guys think? And, everybody looks at each other. And these are like 18-year-olds, right? Okay, I was valedictorian of my class, or I'm an Eagle Scout or whatever, but they're all thinking, was this in the readings? Did I not read this? And there's this first, horrifying thought, right, that I should know the answer, but I don't. And then the light bulb goes off, and one guy in the front row raises his hand, and he suggests that maybe he ought to try to, reverse the lattice composite or ask a question about the nature of the material and where it was on the space shuttle. And then he posits a theory. And then the rest of us go, wow, that professor actually expects us to think for ourselves. And then we realize he just asked us the question that he doesn't know the answer to, that NASA doesn't know the answer to, that no one in the world knows the answer to. It's not in the back of the book. And then the second thought is, not only is it a truly unique question, he actually has confidence that maybe we can reason our way through it to figure out a methodology to solve the problem. So I would say that a lot of education consists of rote learning. You read something, you read the answers in the back of the book, you try to remember what the answers are, and then you regurgitate them back. But there's a point in your life when you have to reason from first principles. So what are first principles? A grasp of math, a grasp of the scientific method, a grasp of elements. At some point you have to build a building. You have to choose an element. Will you choose steel, or will you choose bronze, or will you choose gold, or will you choose silver or ceramic or whatever? If you don't understand the math of civil engineering, and if you don't know anything about material science, then you certainly can't put one thing together with a structure and make it stand or not stand. So engineering in general is about learning enough math, enough science, and then enough engineering technique in order to construct a mechanism that's going to work, right, under whatever the circumstances is you need it to work. And I think that's what it means to reason from first principles. You have to be able to take a clean sheet of paper, literally a clean sheet of paper. Like, for example, I tell you, design something that flies, you get wood. Okay. Design something that flies, you get a metal, pick the metal. Well, we don't design planes with steel. Why? It's the perfect metal for everything except flying. It's just too heavy to fly. You will never, ever successfully design a plane with steel. Without aluminum, you will never design a metal plane. It's just not happening. So if I tell you, design a plane that flies in high winds, that's a different design. Design something that works in cold, right? If you're unable to divine the impact of the change in the material, design something that flies on the moon. But it's different flying on the moon than flying on the Earth, right? What if I change the gravitational constant? What if I change the speed, of sound, right? What if I change the density of the air? How about run a marathon? How about run a marathon at the top of Mount Everest? How about stay alive for a day at the top of Mount Everest?
Rule number 9, borrow against Bitcoin.
A much wiser course of action would be to borrow money against Bitcoin. If you have an appreciating asset, never sell it, finance it. And if the asset's appreciating at 20% a year, and if the interest rate is 5%, then it's pretty obvious what you ought to do is keep the asset, pay 5% interest, because the tax bill on money that's borrowed is zero. So you could live off of your borrowings against your appreciating asset for the rest of your life, without ever paying the asset back, without ever paying the loan back, and without ever paying any income tax, and without ever paying any capital gains tax in the U.S. Other tax regimes may be different, but in the U.S. right now, that would be the treatment.
And rule number 10, the last one before a very special bonus clip, is think for yourself.
The number one thing I got from MIT was confidence and the ability to think for myself. That's the number one thing. My first serious formative memory of MIT is I walk into a material science class. There's 350 people in the lecture hall. The professor walks out, and he is a consultant for NASA. And he's the top of his profession. And he designed these tiles that went on the space shuttle. And he takes one of the tiles, and it's burnt. It's got streaks on it. He holds up in front of the class. He says, on the space shuttle's last reentry, this tile burned off the space shuttle. Nobody at NASA knows why, and we're not sure how to fix it. What do you think? Okay, and this is the first class, the first week, freshman year. We're all 18-year-olds, and it's a bunch of people that are like the class valedictorian from their various schools. And everybody looks at everybody, and there's a pregnant pause for 60 seconds. And you could see what's going on in people's minds, because first they're like, oh my God, is there a reading I missed? And the second thought is, wait a minute, the answer to this question is not in the back of the book. And the third, and then at some point, someone raises their hand and says, well, maybe we should reverse the composite lattices or change the material to something. And everybody goes, oh my God, that must be the bravest student in the world. And it dawns on all of us that this professor, who's the smartest in the world at what he does, working for the leading space agency in the world, doesn't have an answer to a fundamental problem, has never been answered in the history of the human race. He's looking at a bunch of people. He expects you to think for yourself and figure it out. And he thinks maybe you can. And that idea that you can actually solve a problem for the first time in human history, and you're expected to do it, and they're going to give you all the basic tools, the math, the engineering disciplines, the scientific method to do it. I think that's enormously confidence building at the end of the day, because the number one thing you want to learn from your education is how to think, right? How to solve problems. After that, everything else is useful. It's good. It was good to have contacts. It was good to have the social interaction of other intense thinkers. And yes, I think that's probably the second most valuable thing I got at MIT. Mm-hmm. But, I will say that in the 10 years after I left MIT, I worked 3,500 hours a year, 70 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, dealing with problems never before encountered. And I didn't think it was particularly difficult because it was so difficult getting through those 4 years at MIT where I was working 80 to 90 hours a week, intellectually butting heads with the smartest professors, the smartest students, and trying to solve fundamental problems. I kind of felt like it hardened me intellectually to cope in the real world. And so I appreciate the fact that they gave me that kind of tough love. They didn't give us a textbook with 37 questions with the answers in the back of the book and let us memorize the answers, take the test, and give us a 95%.
Now I've got some special bonus clips that I think you're going to enjoy. But before that, it's time for the question of the day. I want to know, what was your single biggest takeaway from this video and your plan of action for the next week? When you just watch a video and you get motivated, the science says you have a 35% chance of actually following through. That's not good enough, Believe Nation. We need to take some action. But when you watch a video, you get motivated and you create a specific plan of action, that number jumps from 35% to 91% chance of you following through. And when you publicly commit to other people, like leaving a comment down in this video, your number jumps to 95% chance of you actually following through on the plan you set for yourself. So I want to know your single biggest takeaway from this video and your plan of action for the next week. Leave it down in the comments below so I can celebrate you.
Bitcoin is not nearly as private as many other cryptocurrency networks like Zcash and Monero and the like. And we've seen just in the past few weeks that law enforcement is able to trace back transactions all the way through a decade. The entire blockchain is completely transparent and immutable, and every transaction that ever took place is traceable. So if anything, I think there's a consensus that's forming amongst regulators and law enforcement that Bitcoin is probably the safest and the most manageable of the crypto asset networks. And if there's any risk with regard to regulation in this regard, it's probably on some of the other crypto application and crypto asset networks because they actually have a much greater intent to promulgate privacy applications. I think that Bitcoin's mission is to be a crypto asset network. The idea is not to move money fast and privately. The idea of Bitcoin is to store $1 billion for 100 years securely. And the network and the architecture has been designed with that in mind.
If you want 10 more amazing rules from Kathy Wood, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
Even if we go through a correction, and I expect one, we must almost always expect corrections. I just have to keep my eye on the prize.